2014 saw a lot of major expectations for the New Orleans Saints. You had a lot of people picking them for the playoffs. In fact, I believe I picked them to be the last entrant in the NFC playoff picture. Now, there were people talking about them making it to the Super Bowl and winning the Super Bowl, and I understood in part why. You look at Drew Brees, they've got a first ballot Hall of Fame quarterback, the weapons they had on offense, throwing into the mix a first round pick like Brandon Cooks. Then you look at a defense that improved mightily under defensive coordinator Rob Ryan in 2013. There were a lot of major expectations there for the New Orleans Saints. And then the 2014 season happened. That defense took a major step back. They struggled to get a pass rush. They struggled to stop anybody in the passing game. And then Drew Brees wasn't as good in the passing game himself. And the Saints just kind of toiled in mediocrity pretty much all year. They never really got their momentum going. They never really got their feet off of the ground. And they ended up missing the playoffs. So I'm not that surprised to see that this organization was somewhat active in terms of trying to shake some things up in the offseason with this organization. They went out in free agency and added somebody like C.J. Spiller, maybe in fact admitting the mistake of allowing themselves to trade Darren Sproles to Philadelphia. They needed that guy to be a complement to Mark Ingram, who, to be fair, had a pretty good season in 2014 when he was on the field. Then you look at them signing somebody like a Brandon Browner. But the big news of all, of course, was this team trading Jimmy Graham and a fourth-round pick to the Seattle Seahawks for Max Unger and a first-round pick. Now, this was a trade that really raised a lot of eyebrows in large part because I think, frankly, it came out of absolutely nowhere. But now looking back on it, we really shouldn't be that surprised by this deal. The New Orleans Saints have been in a bad salary cap situation over the past couple of years. And a salary cap situation that most certainly wasn't going to get any better as long as they had Jimmy Graham's big contract on the books. And while he's an explosive weapon, he wasn't as effective in 2014 because he had that stretch of the season where he was battling an injury. You're tying all that money into a guy at the tight end position that doesn't block very well, and you're not a contending team. Does that really make a whole lot of sense to devote so many resources to one player at one position when you've got so many other holes on both sides of the ball, both offensively and especially defensively? And the answer for the Saints organization was ultimately no. So they traded him away. They bring in Max Unger because, they needed to fortify that offensive line, and they brought in a veteran presence to play in front of Drew Brees, and I understand that. Saints fans probably don't like it, still probably don't get it, and I understand that too. Ultimately, the Saints know that they need to build their team through the draft, in part because they're in an odd situation where they've only got a certain period of time with Drew Brees, and they know that that window is dwindling by the day. They also know that they need to improve that team around Drew Brees because as long as they have him, they feel like they maybe have a window of opportunity to potentially be a contending team, but at the same point in time, they also need to start preparing for LAB, life after Brees. And looking at how bad that defense was, looking at some of the holes they still have on the offensive side of the ball, in particular on that offensive line, and seeing, the fact that, frankly, this team, as I've referenced before, hasn't drafted all that particularly well in recent years, is not that surprising to see the New Orleans Saints wanted to acquire some additional draft pick compensation or draft pick currency because they know that they need to get some work done in the draft. And they went about trying to get some work done in this draft, drafting Andrus Peat, the tackle out of Stanford, with their first-round pick, then Stephon Anthony, the athletic inside linebacker from Clemson, with their second first-round pick, then other guys along the way, such as Alohi Kakaha, the pass rusher out of Washington, and P.J. Williams, the corner out of Florida State. There was definitely a defensive emphasis in the draft, but, you also look at a team that drafted Garrett Grayson out of Colorado State in the third round, perhaps to be the heir apparent to Drew Brees. The bottom line is the Saints know that they needed to get some young talent in this draft. That's also why they traded away Kenny Stills to acquire a third-round pick. Again, that's kind of the mode that the Saints are in. On the one hand, they've got Drew Brees, so they can't totally tank, but at the same point in time, the way they were currently constructed, they were really not going to get anywhere. They were ultimately just going to be stuck in that cycle of toiling and mediocrity and chasing their damn tails. Now, heading into 2015, what are the biggest strengths and concerns for this team? Well, let's start off with their strengths. You still got Drew Brees. And while Drew Brees wasn't the same Drew Brees that we've seen in previous years in 2014, he's still a franchise quarterback. He could still be argued he's an elite quarterback. One less than stellar year doesn't automatically remove you from that ranking, especially when you're talking about an entirety of a body of work. You still got Drew Brees. And when you've got Drew Brees, you've still got a chance. And you could still potentially be in every football game. Now, does that ultimately mean you have a chance to win every football game? No. But it is a lot easier to win football games when you have a quarterback like Drew Brees who can potentially keep you in every football game? Yes, it is. And you also look at the running game that they have. Mark Ingram played really, really well in 2014 when he was on the field. You bring in a guy like C.J. Spiller, who can bring, easy for me to say, that can bring in a nice complement, a Sproles type of complement to a degree, but be perhaps just a slightly better between the tackles runner. That's a nice 1-2 combination at the running back position. And then when you look at this offensive system as a whole, this is a system that's made guys look good over the years, in part because of Drew Brees, but also because of the way Sean Payton deploys people in that system. This is a system that's been in place for a long time, so players in that system have a lot of time to get comfortable with it. There's familiarity there. There's understanding there. And that's as important as anything else that this organization has going for it. But then we get to the concerns. Defensively, I'm concerned about their edge rush, and I'm not really sure that they have one. You can't sit there and just allow quarterbacks in the NFL, even the mediocre ones, to have 5 or 6 seconds to throw, because if they do, they're eventually going to figure out how to beat you, and they're going to pick you apart. So the Saints have to be able to find a way to get a better edge rush out of the outside backers in that 3-4 system. I look at their safeties, and Jairus Byrd and Kenny Vaccaro. And, there were some major expectations for those two guys playing next to each other in 2014, especially with the big contract that they gave Byrd the previous year in the offseason, and looking at how well Vaccaro played in 2013. But you have Byrd go down, and then you have Vaccaro be so bad he ultimately gets benched at one point in time. So I have some real concerns about the safety position. They need those safeties that they've invested heavily in, on the one hand with the first-round draft pick, and on the other hand with the big free agent contract. They need those guys to play like stars, because they're still kind of suspect at the corner position, frankly, and in particular, they're suspect up front with their pass rush from their outside linebackers. So they need safeties that can cover space. They need safeties that can be ball hawks. They need safeties that can make plays. And they need those two guys to be better, and I'm concerned about whether or not they actually will be come this year. But then I have concerns about their offensive line, and I have concerns about how well they could consistently protect Drew Brees. That's something I don't think gets talked about nearly enough. But most importantly of all, I also have concerns about their offensive system. For all the strength that their offensive system is, I think at times it could be their biggest weakness. I think at times they get too in love with the passing game. They get too in love with the 5 to 10 yard pass. They abandon the run. They're always wanting to use this platoon of backs, but they never really get one running back necessarily into a rhythm, if that makes sense. I think that's been something that's been a hindrance to the Saints over the years, and in particular been one of my biggest knocks of Sean Payton and his offensive play calling is the system they run and what they do with it. And when you talk about a team that frankly doesn't have the same talent on the offensive side of the ball at the skill positions like they've had in recent years, should you necessarily be playing the same way that you have in recent years? I don't think so, and I have some concerns if they try to do so again, if that's going to ultimately blow up in their face. Now, in terms of players to watch this year, I look at their last 2 first-round picks. Kenny Vaccaro, their first-round pick from 2013, and Brandon Cooks, their first-round pick from 2014. Cooks was really good when he played, but then once he got hurt, he missed the rest of the year. They need Cooks to find a way to be able to be healthy and play all 16 games, especially now that they lost Jimmy Graham and Marcus Colston's at the tail end of his career. They need Brandon Cooks to be that multi-dimensional, versatile weapon out of the slot and on the outside that they envisioned when they traded up in the draft to get him with the 20th overall pick in 2014. And they need Vaccaro to play more like he did as a rookie. They need Vaccaro to play like a safety he would have taken in the first round of a draft. They need him to be an impact player on the back end of that defense. And then I also look at Hau'oli Kikaha, their 3rd-round pick out of Washington. The New Orleans Saints need an edge rusher in a bad way, and Kikaha could potentially be that impact edge rusher right away that they so badly need in a bad way. And if he could come in and he could provide them some edge rush on the outside, it is obviously going to help that Saints defense, which I think makes him a very important player to watch. In terms of the Saints' schedule this year, got a couple of different stretches to watch. First is weeks 3 through 5. It's kind of a brutal stretch. They got to travel to Carolina, then they host Dallas, and they got to travel to Philadelphia. They got to find a way to win at least one of those games. It'd be great if you could win 2, but you got to find a way to win at least one of them. If you could only win one of them, you would prefer to beat Carolina, But at that point in time of the season, you take a win wherever you can get it. The Saints have got to find a way to win at least one of those first three games, or one of those 3 games in that 3 week stretch between weeks 3 and 5, because they go 0-3 in that stretch. They're already digging themselves a big hole, and it's going to be really hard for them to dig themselves out of it. And then I look at weeks 9, 10, and 12, 3 games that could be potentially winnable if they can sit there and kind of tread water. This could be an area of the schedule where they can make a little hay. They host the Giants, they host the Titans, and they travel to Washington. Again, 3 potentially winnable games. 3 teams that the Saints on a good day can feel like they can beat. And you got to be able to defend your home turf, especially if you're the Saints, because that Mercedes-Benz Superdome is supposed to be such a huge home field advantage for them. Well, 2 of those 3 games are at home, and 1 of those games is against the Redskins on the road. The Saints, if they have any thoughts of improving on last year's performance and perhaps getting into the wild card race in the NFC, they need to find a way to win those 3 games. Ultimately, though, I just don't like the vibe that I have for the Saints team. I understand why they traded Jimmy Graham. I get why they traded Jimmy Graham. But ultimately, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a better football team in 2015. It doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be a whole lot worse either. As long as they have Drew Brees, unless he gets hurt, I don't really see where this team is going to bottom out. I think the absolute floor for them is maybe 5-11 or 6-10, but I don't really see where they're a whole lot better than that. When I look at this team, I don't see where this defense is going to get much better. I still think in a lot of ways they're going to be far too in love with the passing game. That is, I don't necessarily believe is going to be as effective in years past with no more Jimmy Graham. So as a result, I think this is a team that at best would be lucky to win 7 or 8 games. The Saints are in a kind of interesting place right now. As long as you got Brees, you can't really tank out because you're not in a rebuild mode. But in all actuality, they are in a rebuild mode, and that's exactly the mode you need to be in, because in no way, shape, or form is this roster resembling anything close to a championship contender.